Hi everyone, today we're going to be learning how to graph what we call compound inequalities. So far we've been working with just some simple inequalities that look something like this, right? Basic inequalities, and we've learned how to graph them and we've learned how to solve some more complex ones. But today we're going to be working with compound inequalities. And what those are two separate inequalities joined by the words and, or. So for example, you might have inequalities that say something like x is greater than 2 and x is less than or equal to 5, or we might have something that says x is less than 2 or x is greater than or equal to 5. So it's basically joining together two inequalities using the words and or. And so we're going to learn today how we graph them. Now, for and inequalities, we use and when we want two inequalities to both be true. So for example here, it says all the numbers that are greater than -2. So I'm going to call that all the numbers that are greater than -2. We could say x is greater than -2 and that are less than or equal to 1. So and x is less than or equal to 1. So in terms of graphing, if I were to graph those, I'm going to take my first inequality and I have x is greater than -2. So I know I'm going to have an open circle on -2, and since it's greater than, I know I'm going to shade to the right. Now, for my second inequality, I have x is greater than or equal to 1, so I know I have a closed circle here. Now in this case, I would shade to the left. Now, since I want both of these inequalities to be true, essentially what's going to happen is those I'm going to shade in where they're going to overlap, which is everywhere in between. So I would shade in between those two values. So I remember and inequalities and their graphs because I think of a sandwich. Right, I see the word and I notice that the shading is sandwiched in between those two endpoints. Now, these are our and inequalities, but oftentimes you won't actually see the word and. So this is actually what happens. Just like our shading is sandwiched in between the two numbers, we're going to have an x that's sandwiched in between two values. On this side, I'm going to have my -2. And on this side, I would have my +1. Now, since this is a closed circle, this is actually going to have the line underneath. So a lot of times, and actually more often than not, you're going to see ands looking like this, with the x sandwiched in between the two numbers on either end. The other thing I want to point out is these inequality symbols here, right? Those are always, sorry, I have my arrows pointing over there, but those are always going to be less than symbols. So you're always going to point them as less thans. The only change you might make is to use this bar underneath to show it's less than or equal to. Okay, so that's and. The next one we have is or inequalities. And here we want one or the other, or the other inequality to be true. So they don't have to both be true, we just want one or the other. So if I'm looking here, I've got all the numbers that are greater than or equal to 2. So I have x is greater than or equal to 2, or are less than -1. So or x is less than -1. So if I were to graph those, I have greater than or equal to 2. So at 2, I'm going to have a closed circle, and I'm going to shade to the right. Or for x less than -1, at -1, I'm going to have an open circle and shade to the left. So those are actually going to be pointing away from each other. These two pieces would be the pieces of my graph. So I kind of think of them as the oars of a boat, right? The oars are the paddles, and if I were going to paddle a boat, I would have one paddle pointing off one side of the boat and the other pointing off the other side. So that's kind of a trick I use to remember that. All right, so the first thing then we need to be able to do is if we're given a compound inequality, we need to be able to sketch a graph on the number line. So let's look at number 1. So I notice that my x is sandwiched in between those two values. It means my graph is also going to be sandwiched in between these two values. So if I look on the left side, I'm going to have an open circle at -2. And I know it's open because there's no bar underneath here. On this side, I've got +1. And since it says less than or equal to, I'm going to have a closed circle here. And just like this x is sandwiched in between, I'm going to shade everything in between those two values. And that would be the graph of my inequality. All right, we'll do number 2 next. So in this case, my left endpoint here is at -1. And because it says less than or equal to, I'm going to have a closed circle at -1. On the right, I have a +3. Since it's strictly less than, I'm going to have an open circle. And again, just like x is sandwiched in between, I'm going to shade in between those two values. All right, let's skip down to number 4. Now number 4, the oars are obviously easy to recognize because we actually see the word or. So basically what's happening here is I'm just graphing two simple inequalities. So my first one I see is x is greater than 3. So I'm going to put an open circle at 3 and the arrow is pointing right, so I'm going to shade to the right. For my other inequality, I have x is less than -1. So I have an open circle at -1 and I'm going to shade off to the left. And those two pieces make up the graph. All right, number 5, again, I see or here. It looks very similar to start, so x is greater than 3. At 3, I have an open circle and I shade to the right. On this side, I have x is less than or equal to -2. -2, I'm going to have a closed circle and shade to the left. Okay, so from here we'll move on. That's how we graph our inequalities. The next thing we're going to do, much like when we were doing simple inequalities, is now we're going to actually write the inequality if we're given a graph. So if I look at number 9, the first thing I need to notice, and I know sometimes it's kind of hard to see, this shading, is in between these two values. Right? I know it's hard to see, but you can tell it's a little darker here. So my shading is in between, which tells me that this is an and inequality. I know in my and inequality, my x is going to be sandwiched in between two less than symbols. So now I just have to pick the values off of the graph. So here I can see is a -1. Since that's an open circle, I'm going to leave that as less than symbol alone. On this side over here, it looks I have 1, 2, that's going to be a 3. And since I have a closed circle, I have to put my little bar under there to show that x is less than or equal to 3. Now, if I skip, I'm going to skip down to 13 here. I can see now that I have two inequalities, right, that are facing separate ways. So here I'm just going to write two simple inequalities joined by the word or. So if I look on this side, I can see I have x is less than or equal to -2, or I have, let's see, this looks like the value is 2, x is greater than 2. So I just have those two inequalities. All right, last thing we're going to do, or we need to be able to do, is to actually translate a phrase into an inequality, and then we're going to graph it. So we'll do a couple of these, and then we'll be set. Now, the key here when we're translating, we need to make sure we look for the words and, or, the word or, because that's going to tell us what kind of inequality that we have. So if I look at number 17, it says all real numbers that are greater than -2 and less than, it looks like this got cut off. So let's make this less than 1. So all numbers that are greater than -2 and less than 1. So as soon as I see the word and, I know that I have a sandwich here. I have my x that's sandwiched in between the two values. Now the key here is the number on the left is always going to be the smaller of the two numbers. So in this case, my smaller number is -2, and I'm going to make a note here that's the smaller number. And then on the right, my larger number is 1. Now, since I don't have any greater than or equal to or less than or equal to, we have our inequality here. So now to graph it, I'm going to have an open circle at -2, an open circle at +1, and I just shade everywhere in between. For 18, I have all real numbers that are less than 0 or greater than or equal to 2. So I have just two separate inequalities. So first thing I'm going to do is look on the left. So it said all real numbers that are less than 0. So that translates to x is less than 0. I have my or, all real numbers that are greater than or equal to 2. So or x is greater than or equal to 2. So there's our inequality. We'll go ahead and graph it. I have an open circle at 0, shading to the left. And then greater than or equal to 2, so I have a closed circle at 2, and I'm going to shade it to the right. Okay. So we'll be practicing these same skills when we're back in class. We'll use some of these problems as a quick warm-up at the start of class before you start your individual practice. All right, have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.